Okay, so whenever you see problems like these where you're asked to find what is the value of the angle theta between 0 and 2 pi, that's just one lap around the unit circle. So we're going to be looking for angles that have a sine of that angle that's equal to 1/2. So those angles I need to look on my unit circle at are the ones, remember sine is the y value, so I want to find the angles where they have a y coordinate of 1/2. So in quadrant 1 here at pi over 6, I've got a y coordinate of 1/2. So pi over 6 is going to be a solution. But is that the only solution? So I'm going to keep looking as we go around the circle for another coordinate of 1/2, and there's another y value at 5 pi over 6 where the 1/2 is positive. So 5 pi over 6 will also be a solution. If we keep going, when we get into the third quadrant, here at 7 pi over 6, it's a negative 1/2, and that's not going to work because it's not positive. Same thing at 11 pi over 6 in quadrant 4, it's a negative, so I can't use that as an angle. So there's two answers to this equation. Pi over 6 and 5 pi over 6 are the angles that have a sine of 1/2. Okay, now for secant, remember, is the reciprocal of the cosine. So if I want to find the angles that have a secant of -2, the reciprocal of -2 is -1/2. So I'm going to be looking for angles that have a cosine, which is the x-coordinate, of -1/2. Those would be asking the same question. So on my circle, okay, now we're looking at x values for cosine. -1/2 would be here at 2 pi over 3. So that would be a solution. Theta equals 2 pi over 3. And then as we keep going, where else do we have a -1/2? Right here at 4 pi over 3, right? 4 pi over 3 has an x-coordinate of -1/2. Okay, and those would be the solutions where the cosine of 2 pi over 3 is -1/2. The secant then of 2 pi over 3 is also -2, right? Same for 4 pi over 3. Cosine of 4 pi over 3 is -1/2. Secant of 4 pi over 3 is -2. Okay, the last one then we want to look at is the tangent of theta equals -1. And tangent, remember, is the ratio of the sine divided by the cosine of that angle. And the only way that a number divided by itself is equal to -1 is when they have the same values but opposite signs, like positive and negative. So we need to find angles where we've got a positive and a negative coordinate and they have the same value. So when we look at our circle, quadrant 1, everything is positive, so it can't be there. In quadrant 3, everything is negative, so it can't be there. So I need an answer from quadrant 2 and quadrant 4 because they have opposite signs, one positive, one negative. And when I look at the options in those quadrants, here at 3 pi over 4, right? Notice how I've got a root 2 over 2 divided by a negative root 2 over 2. That's -1. So that's the one that I need to have a tangent of -1. So my first answer is going to be 3 pi over 4. And that was from quadrant 2. In quadrant 4, right, I've got positives, negatives as well. And at 7 pi over 4, I would be taking negative root 2 over 2 divided by positive root 2 over 2. That's -1. So the tangent of 7 pi over 4 is -1. And that's my second answer, 7 pi over 4. Okay, so I hope that that helped with some of those problems. If you are looking at the practice worksheet that was on 5.3, these are the problems like number 48 through 56. So hopefully that will give you some guidance on how to proceed with those. Thanks.